Some people collect vintage cars, others collect rare art. Kanye West? He collects public controversies like they're going out of style, and today we're diving into the psychology behind every single one of them. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode where I pretend to understand human psychology despite dropping out of my psych degree to pursue what my parents still call internet nonsense. Today we're diving headfirst into the absolutely chaotic mind of Kanye West, a man who somehow convinced the world that wearing a leather skirt to a concert was a reasonable fashion choice. Before we start this completely unauthorized psychological evaluation, drop a comment below and let me know which other celebrities you think desperately need a mental health check, because I'm always hunting for new subjects to thoroughly misanalyze. And hey, if you enjoy watching me butcher basic psychology while making questionable observations about famous people, smash that subscribe button like Kanye smashes award show stages. So let's talk about Kanye Omari West, born June 8, 1977 in Atlanta, Georgia, to what seemed like a pretty normal middle-class family. His mother, Donda, was an English professor, and his father, Ray, was a photojournalist and church counsellor. Now, you might think, oh, stable academic family, church involvement, this guy should be well adjusted, right? Wrong. So incredibly wrong. When Kanye was 3, his parents divorced and he moved to Chicago with his mother. And here's where things get psychologically interesting, because single mother households aren't inherently problematic. But when that single mother happens to be an English professor who probably spent more time correcting grammar than addressing emotional development, well, that creates a very specific type of personality. Picture this. Little Kanye growing up in an environment where intellectual achievement was probably valued above emotional intelligence, where being articulate and creative was rewarded, but where healthy boundaries and humility might have been, shall we say, optional curriculum. His mother was clearly supportive, maybe even a little too supportive. She was the type of parent who probably told young Kanye he was a genius so often that he started believing it was a documented medical fact rather than maternal bias. And this is where we see the first seeds of what psychologists would call grandiose narcissism beginning to sprout like weeds in an untended garden. Now, Kanye started making beats in his basement as a teenager, and by the late 90s, he was producing tracks for local Chicago artists. But here's the thing about Kanye. He didn't just want to be a producer. No, that would be too simple, too humble. He wanted to rap. Everyone told him he couldn't rap. Record executives, other artists, probably his own reflection in the mirror. But did he listen? Of course not. Because when you've been raised to believe you're exceptional at everything, the concept of limitation becomes as foreign as reading the terms and conditions before clicking agree. You might be wondering, is this just confidence or is this something deeper? Well, let me paint you a picture of classic narcissistic personality traits, and you tell me if any of this sounds familiar. First, there's the grandiose sense of self-importance. This is a man who once said, and I quote, "I am a god." Not metaphorically, not poetically. Just straight up declared his divinity like he was updating his LinkedIn profile. Then there's the preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success and power. Kanye doesn't just make music, he's revolutionizing the entire concept of sound. He doesn't just design clothes, he's reimagining the future of human expression through fabric. Everything he touches isn't just good, it's historically significant, genre-defining, civilization-altering. But here's where it gets psychologically fascinating. Narcissists typically have this weird relationship with criticism where they either completely dismiss it or they have absolutely nuclear meltdowns about it. And oh boy, does Kanye deliver on this front. Remember the Taylor Swift incident at the 2009 VMAs? Picture this. Taylor Swift, barely 20 years old, wins her first VMA, and she's giving this sweet, genuine acceptance speech. Then suddenly, like a tornado made of ego, and poor impulse control, Kanye storms the stage, grabs the microphone, and essentially tells the world that Beyoncé deserved the award more. Now, from a psychological perspective, this wasn't just rudeness. This was a textbook display of what we call narcissistic injury. Kanye couldn't tolerate the idea that someone else was receiving praise and attention that he felt should be directed elsewhere, specifically towards something he approved of. It's like watching a toddler have a meltdown because another kid got a bigger slice of cake, except the toddler is a grown man with a microphone and a global audience. But wait, it gets weirder. After the backlash from that incident, instead of genuine remorse, Kanye exhibited what psychologists call narcissistic deflection. He didn't really apologize for his behavior. He apologized for the timing, the execution, the public perception. Everything except the core belief that he was right to do it. You might think, okay, maybe that was just one bad night. Everyone makes mistakes. But then there's the pattern, the consistent, predictable pattern of behavior that reads like a psychology textbook chapter on personality disorders. Let's talk about his relationship with social media, specifically Twitter, which became like his personal psychological laboratory, where he conducted daily experiments in public self-destruction. Kanye's Twitter feed was basically a real-time stream of consciousness from someone who apparently never learned that some thoughts should stay in your head. We're talking about 3 a.m. rants about everything from his creative process to his personal grievances, delivered with the emotional regulation of a caffeinated teenager. One minute he'd be declaring his love for Donald Trump. The next he'd be announcing his presidential campaign. Then he'd pivot to complaining about his record label, all while designing what he called the future of architecture, and claiming that traditional education was a scam. It's like watching someone play psychological bingo, except every square is filled with a different manifestation of grandiosity and poor impulse control. Now, somebody once asked me if Kanye might be dealing with bipolar disorder, and honestly, that's not an unfair question. His public behavior has shown classic signs of what psychologists call manic episodes: the rapid speech, the grandiose ideas, the decreased need for sleep, the hypergraphia, which is basically the compulsive need to write or create constantly. Kanye himself has been open about his bipolar diagnosis, which actually makes a lot of his behavior make more psychological sense. Bipolar disorder, especially when it's untreated or inadequately managed, can amplify existing personality traits to almost cartoonish proportions. So if you already have narcissistic tendencies, a manic episode can turn you into what basically amounts to a human megaphone for your own ego. But here's what's really interesting from a psychological standpoint. Kanye's creativity and his mental health struggles seem to be deeply intertwined, like two snakes wrapped around each other in a way that's both fascinating and slightly terrifying to observe. His best music often comes from his most chaotic periods. My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy was created after the Taylor Swift incident, when he was basically exiled from the music industry. It's like he channels his psychological turmoil into artistic expression, which would be beautiful if it didn't also involve so much collateral damage to everyone around him. Speaking of collateral damage, let's talk about his relationships, because they're like a masterclass in how personality disorders affect interpersonal connections. His marriage to Kim Kardashian was basically a psychological case study in what happens when you combine narcissistic personality traits with bipolar disorder and then add the pressure of constant public scrutiny. Kanye's relationship patterns show classic signs of what psychologists call idealization and devaluation. He'd put people on pedestals, declare them perfect, life-changing, revolutionary. Then, inevitably, when they failed to meet his impossible standards or challenged his worldview, he'd completely turn on them. We saw this with his relationship with Jay-Z, his various collaborators, even his relationship with his own mother's memory, which he's both idealized and complicated through his public statements and artistic choices. And then there's the name change to Yeah. Now, you might think this was just a branding decision, but psychologically, it's actually pretty revealing. Changing your name, especially to something as minimalist as Ye, can be a form of identity reconstruction. It's like he was trying to shed all the complexity and baggage of Kanye West and become something simpler, more essential. But here's the thing about personality. It doesn't change just because you change your name. It's like putting a new coat of paint on a house with structural problems. The foundation issues are still there. They're just temporarily covered up. You might be wondering, what about his anti-Semitic comments? How do those fit into this psychological profile? Well, this is where things get really dark, and we need to talk about how untreated mental health issues can sometimes manifest as conspiracy thinking and scapegoating behavior. When someone with narcissistic traits experiences what they perceive as persecution or failure, they often look for external explanations, rather than engaging in self-reflection. It's psychologically easier to blame a shadowy conspiracy than to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, your behavior has consequences. Kanye's anti-Semitic statements weren't just random bigotry, they were part of a psychological pattern where he was looking for someone to blame for his professional and personal setbacks. And unfortunately, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories provided a ready-made explanation that didn't require him to examine his own behavior. This is actually a pretty common psychological phenomenon. When people with certain personality disorders feel threatened or criticized, they sometimes latch onto conspiracy theories because it allows them to maintain their sense of superiority while explaining away their problems. It's like psychological comfort food, except instead of ice cream, it's hatred and paranoia. Now let's talk about his fashion career, because it's basically a perfect example of how grandiose narcissism manifests in creative fields. Kanye didn't just want to make clothes, he wanted to revolutionize fashion, to be mentioned in the same breath as Coco Chanel and Giorgio Armani. He approached fashion with the same messianic complex he brought to music. The Yeezy brand became an extension of his personality, which means it was simultaneously innovative and completely self-absorbed. The designs were often interesting, but they were also priced like they were made from threads of pure genius rather than, regular fabric. And when fashion critics didn't immediately hail him as the next great designer, his response was predictably narcissistic. It wasn't that his designs might need work or that fashion is subjective. No, it was that the fashion industry was racist, elitist, and incapable of recognizing true innovation. But here's what's psychologically fascinating about Kanye. Despite all these personality issues, despite the public meltdowns and the controversial statements, he's genuinely talented. His early albums were legitimately groundbreaking. He did change the sound of hip-hop in significant ways. This is what makes analysing him so complicated. He's not just a delusional person claiming to be a genius. He actually has genuine creative abilities, which makes his psychological issues more tragic than just pathetic. It's like watching someone with the potential to be truly great systematically sabotage themselves through their own personality flaws. It's frustrating and sad, and occasionally infuriating all at the same time. You might ask, could therapy have helped him? Well, here's the thing about personality disorders, especially narcissistic ones. The people who most need therapy are often the least likely to seek it out, because seeking therapy requires acknowledging that you might have problems, and acknowledging problems is basically kryptonite to the narcissistic ego. Kanye has mentioned therapy in interviews, but his approach to it seems to be similar to his approach to everything else. He wants therapists who will validate his worldview rather than challenge it. He's looking for professional enablers rather than actual mental health treatment. It's like going to a doctor and only wanting to hear that you're perfectly healthy, regardless of what the tests show. And then there's the role of fame in all of this. Fame is basically psychological poison for someone with narcissistic tendencies. It provides constant validation for grandiose beliefs while insulating you from normal social consequences. When you're famous, people laugh at your jokes even when they're not funny. They agree with your opinions even when they're ridiculous. They enable your worst impulses because they want access to your success. For someone like Kanye, fame was like giving rocket fuel to a personality that was already prone to explosive behavior. It amplified every psychological issue he had, while removing most of the natural checks and balances that keep normal people somewhat grounded in reality. But here's what I find most psychologically interesting about Kanye West. Despite all his grandiosity and narcissism, there are moments of genuine vulnerability in his music and interviews, where you can see the scared, insecure person underneath all the bravado. Songs like Heard 'Em Say and Hey Mama show someone who's capable of genuine emotion and self-reflection. It's like catching glimpses of who he might have been if he'd developed better coping mechanisms and emotional regulation skills. The tragedy of Kanye West, from a psychological perspective, is that he's a genuinely talented person whose mental health issues and personality flaws have prevented him from reaching his full potential as both an artist and a human being. He's like a sports car with a broken steering wheel. All that power and potential, but no real control over where it's going. And the really sad part is that his influence on younger artists and fans means that his psychological issues don't just affect him. They get normalized and even celebrated as part of the artistic genius package. We've created a culture where we excuse destructive behavior as long as it comes with creative output, which is basically enabling mental illness on a societal level. So what can we learn from the psychological profile of Kanye West? Well, first, that talent and mental health are completely separate things. You can be incredibly gifted and still be psychologically unhealthy. Success doesn't cure personality disorders, it often just gives them a bigger stage. Second, that untreated mental health issues don't just affect the individual. They ripple out and affect everyone in that person's orbit, from family members to fans to complete strangers who have to witness the public meltdowns. And finally, that we need to stop romanticizing psychological dysfunction as part of the creative process. The idea that you need to be mentally unstable to be a great artist is not just wrong, it's actively harmful. Kanye West could have been just as creative, possibly more so, if he'd developed better emotional regulation and interpersonal skills. His mental health struggles didn't enhance his creativity, they limited it by making him increasingly isolated and paranoid. In conclusion, Kanye West is basically what happens when you combine genuine talent with untreated personality disorders, add fame and unlimited resources, and then remove most normal social consequences. He's a walking psychology textbook, except the textbook is on fire and occasionally says problematic things about Jewish people. So there you have it, folks. The completely unauthorized, thoroughly unqualified psychological analysis of Kanye West. A man who proves that you can be simultaneously brilliant and completely unhinged, often within the same sentence. If you enjoyed this deep dive into celebrity mental health issues, make sure to subscribe for more content where I pretend to understand human psychology while making questionable observations about famous people. And remember, if you're struggling with your own mental health, please seek help from actual qualified professionals, not semi-educated internet personalities who dropped out of psychology programs to make YouTube videos. Until next time, this has been your favorite unqualified analyst, reminding you that sometimes the most interesting people are the ones who probably shouldn't be role models. Peace out, and try not to interrupt any award shows this week.